The explosion didn't come from my shotgun. It came from my driveway. A fireball lit up the sky as chunks of rusted metal rained down across the pasture. One of the HOA board members was on the ground clutching his leg and screaming. And at that right, there was the moment they realized they'd parked in the wrong damn driveway. Yep, that's me. You're probably wondering how I got here. You ever live so far out that the wind sounds different? Not the city kind that whistles between buildings or rattles the glass in overpriced condos, but the kind that moves across open fields, dances through cornrows, and makes your bones feel older than they are. That's the wind I woke up to every morning out here on the last real piece of land my family hadn't sold. 67 acres of misfit heaven wrapped in a rusted barbed wire fence and anchored by the old farmhouse my great-granddaddy built with his bare hands and a stubborn mule. I had 2 dogs, Buck and Lucy, 3 chickens that hated me, a goat named Credence, who thought he ran the place, and a driveway, so long you could lose cell service halfway up it. It wasn't perfect, but it was quiet until the subdivision came in. You'd think building a gated community next to a working farm would be a non-starter, but money talks and the county board had been half asleep when the developers snuck in that zoning reclassification. They named it something pretentious like Silver Creek Hollow, even though the only creek on record ran straight through my property, and the only thing hollow was their sense of respect. At first, it was harmless. Fancy people in shiny cars moving into identical beige boxes with matching yard flags and solar-powered gnomes. They smiled, waved, probably thought I was the groundskeeper. Then came the flyers. Community reminder. Outdoor structures must be visually harmonious with adjacent homes. Folded neatly and left in my mailbox. My rural, non-governed mailbox. I laughed the first time. The second time I started collecting them. By the 6th, I had a drawer full of what they called courtesy notices, complete with passive-aggressive underlines and vague threats about property values. And then she came, clipboard in hand, lip gloss shining like a car dealership inflatable tube man, and a tight little smirk that could curdle buttermilk. Karen, of course, her name was Karen. She introduced herself as the HOA board president, acting like she'd just been appointed to Congress. Said she wanted to open a dialogue about the state of visual cohesion between the subdivision and neighboring properties of concern. I asked if she'd like some lemonade. She declined. I offered her a rake and pointed to the back pasture. She declined that too, said she'd circle back with some landscaping ideas. What followed was a parade of unsolicited suggestions, mostly about how I might improve my fencing, repaint my barn a more community-friendly color, and consider relocating my antique weather vane because it resembled a weapon from certain angles. I told her if it started firing on its own, she'd be the first to know. The real trouble started on a Tuesday night. I was up late rewiring a busted porch light when I noticed headlights bouncing down my driveway. Slow, deliberate, and way too familiar. I watched from the shadows as a white Lexus SUV rolled right up to the fork where my gravel split. One way to the barn, the other to my workshop. Then it parked. Just sat there. Nobody got out. About 10 minutes later, another car pulled in, then another. A black Range Rover, a blue Audi. All of them idling like they were waiting for valet service. Eventually, they turned off their lights and climbed out, dressed in matching windbreakers with Silver Creek HOA printed across the back, like some kind of paramilitary law enforcement unit. They weren't there for me. No knock on the door, no clipboard visit, just walked down my damn property like it was a park, cut through the far pasture gate, and vanished into the treant. I didn't sleep that night. Next morning, I found tire tracks in my field and half a cigar stub crushed into my gravel like a middle finger. I asked around. No one knew anything. When I brought it up to Karen, she blinked real slow and said they were conducting a routine security sweep of community-adjacent perimeters. I asked when they'd started doing that on private land. She told me my driveway was unmarked and ambiguous in jurisdiction. I told her my dogs would be unambiguous if they saw strangers again. She didn't like that. Over the next few weeks, the pattern repeated. Always at night, always the same cars. Sometimes they'd leave trash behind. Coffee cups, wine bottles, a plastic name badge once that read M. Hawthorne, board secretary. I started putting up signs. Private property. No trespassing. Whole members will be towed or fed to the goat. They disappeared overnight, even the ones I nailed to trees. I caught one guy using my side gate to shortcut through my pasture. When I confronted him, He said he assumed it was community green space. I asked if community green space usually had a goat with a bell and a sign that said, "Eat shoes." He laughed. I didn't. I filed a complaint with the sheriff. He said it was a civil issue. Said unless I had video or someone threatened me directly, it was just a neighborly misunderstanding. Then he asked if I'd thought about putting in a gate. That's when I realized they weren't just being lazy. They were using my land to bypass their own dumb layout. The main entrance to Silver Creek was a single road looping half a mile out to the highway. My driveway cut that time in half. And somewhere in that subdivision planning meeting, someone figured out it was easier to trespass than fix their design flaw. I installed cameras, bought a drone. The footage was textbook. Cars pulling in, people walking out, heading straight for the back fence line like ants to sugar. I posted the videos on Nextdoor. Karen had them flagged for inflammatory content. I emailed them to the HOA's legal contact, got an automated reply. I called the county to ask if anyone had requested an easement across my land. They hadn't, but the clerk helpfully informed me that Karen had filed a complaint about my safety hazards and lack of lighting along the driveway. The gall of these people. They wanted to treat my land like a damn strip mall access road. And they had the nerve to criticize my gravel. The final straw came when I found my dogs locked in the workshop one morning, whining and agitated. The gate was open. The cameras were disabled. Someone had been close, real close. I knew then that polite signs, cameras, and conversations weren't going to work. They saw my silence as consent, my land as common ground, my home as a scenic shortcut. But what they didn't know was that I'd been reading, researching, planning. Not for revenge. Not yet. That part would come later. But for now, I just wanted them to remember what it felt like to be watched. To feel like maybe, just maybe, one of those gravel mounds along my driveway wasn't just dirt. The signs didn't work. The cameras didn't work. Even catching them on tape didn't work. If anything, my efforts to play nice seemed to egg them on like it was some kind of HOA hazing ritual. That week, they escalated from cutting across my land to actively loitering on it, like my backyard was their clubhouse annex. It started on a Friday evening. I was coming back from town with a fresh bag of feed and 2 replacement light bulbs for the barn, only to find 5 folding chairs arranged in a semicircle by my tractor shed. The chairs weren't mine. Neither was the Halliton cheese plate sitting on a blanket next to an empty bottle of Chardonnay. I stopped the truck mid-turn and just stared at them. 5 of the HOA board members, Karen included, sat there sipping wine like they were hosting a vineyard tour, not trespassing on private farmland. They were loud, laughing about something Karen said. And for a second, I thought maybe they'd booked a tour and gotten lost. But then I saw the sign I'd hand-painted and staked just 2 days prior. Private property, no parking, no picnics, ripped in half and stuffed under someone's purse like a dirty napkin. I got out, didn't say a word at first, just walked right past them to the shed and started unloading feed, slamming the tailgate harder than necessary. They barely acknowledged me. One of them, Kevin, I think, or maybe Todd, one of those golf shirt types, raised his plastic cup and said, "Evening." Like we were old friends. Karen turned in her chair and said, "We figured the view here was too nice to waste. Hope you don't mind. We'll clean up after ourselves." I told them I absolutely did mind, and that if they were going to play Somalia on someone else's land, they ought to bring a damn permit. Karen waved it off like I'd offered her a low Yelp rating. "We're just neighbors sharing space," she said. "There's no need to make this adversarial." Then she pointed toward the far corner of my pasture and said, "Technically, it's all unmarked out there. We assumed it was communal." I didn't say what I wanted to say. Instead, I let Buck out of the truck. Buck is part cattle dog, part low-flying missile. He didn't bite. He's too well-trained for that. But he herded those wine-sipping interlopers so fast they dropped their cheese knives and spilled a full bottle of Sauvignon Blanc across Karen's pantsuit. I didn't apologize, and they didn't come back the next day, but they came back Sunday. This time in the form of reflective driveway markers, bright orange, hammered into the gravel with little HOA stickers at the top, 30 feet into my land. I don't know if they were marking it for future use or trying to claim it like settlers at the Oklahoma land rush, but either way, it felt like a declaration. I pulled them up. Next morning they were back, this time with laminated paper signs zip-tied to my fence posts. Community overflow parking in effect. Silver Creek Hollow HOA authorization. 14F authorization. From whom? God. Because last I checked, Neither Karen nor the board owned an inch of the gravel they were squatting on. I tore those down, too. Next came the trash. Not the accidental kind. No, these were full-size Starbucks cups placed carefully on top of my gate post. One had the word thanks written on the side in Sharpie. Another time, someone left behind a rolled yoga mat and a water bottle like they'd used my pasture for their morning stretches. I filed another report with the county. Another non-response civil matter, they said. Maybe work it out with the HOA leadership. Yeah, because that had gone so well before. Then about a week after I tossed their last bottle into the garbage, I got a letter taped to my workshop door, bright yellow city seal on top, and stamped urgent zoning complaint. According to the anonymous report, I was operating an unlicensed RV park complete with multiple non-compliant dwellings and illegal graywater discharge. I blinked, then I laughed, then I didn't. Because as ridiculous as it was, this all stemmed from my cousin's busted camper he'd left behind after his divorce. It was now part of the public record. Some clipboard-wielding idiot could show up and start measuring things. And if there's one thing the government loves more than property taxes, it's a code violation with an attached fine. I called the number listed. Took me 3 tries to get someone on the line. When I did, the woman was polite but firm. The complaint was filed with accompanying photos. She said, "We are obligated to investigate within 10 business days." Accompanying photos? That meant someone had been close enough to snapshots from inside my fence line. I asked if she could tell me who filed the complaint. She couldn't. Anonymous tip, she said. I already knew. And that's when I stopped being neighborly. I pulled out the dusty old filing cabinet in the back of the farmhouse and started digging. My grandfather was a pack rat and a legal nerd. 2 qualities that had made him a nightmare to deal with, but a gold mine in moments like this. In between handwritten chicken feed logs and faded Sears catalogs, I found a brittle manila envelope labeled County Rights 1, 94 1947. Inside, I found a document that made me sit up straighter. It was a mineral rights grant filed in 1/94 signed by a judge whose name sounded like a bad bourbon Clifton Bogard Longley. It outlined permissible extraction activities on Parcel D, which after a quick property overlay with a map I printed from the assessor's office, turned out to be my land. The language was archaic, but one section stood out in glorious typewriter ink. Landowner retains full discretion to employ deterrent-based explosive mining equipment to discourage unauthorized encroachment or unlawful trespass. It had been filed back when dynamite was sold over the counter and half the county was made of coal and gumption, but it hadn't been revoked, and more importantly, it hadn't been superseded. I took that clause and ran with it figuratively and literally. The next week, I scoured auctions, scrapyards, and surplus stores until I found what I needed. A Halfosen rusted-out water heater tanks, some smoke bombs, a few lengths of pressure-sensitive garden hose, and several heavy-duty, unexploded ordnance. Do not touch signs I ordered off a military surplus site that didn't ask questions. I painted them olive drab, scorched them with a blowtorch for that recently detonated look, and buried them halfway in the gravel along the curve where HOA cars love to linger. Each one had a shallow trench dug beneath it with wires running into the earth, not connected to anything, but just visible enough to make someone think twice. I mounted an old World War I-style danger placard on a steel rod at the head of the driveway. Mind era, no vehicles beyond this point. Trespassers may detonate live ordnance. The next morning, Buck and I sat on the porch with our coffee, watching as Karen's Lexus rolled up to the usual parking spot, then brake, then reversed very, very slowly. That night, the HOA newsletter was updated. They called it a Community Parking Reassessment Initiative. I called it a win. For a while, it worked. No cars, no trash, no clipboard visits. They crossed the street instead of using my driveway. The pasture was quiet again. But if you've ever fought with an HOA before, you know peace is just the eye of the hurricane. And the barometric pressure was dropping fast. For a few blessed weeks, things were quiet. No cars idling at the end of my driveway. No HOA safari expeditions cutting through my pasture. Karen had retreated like a raccoon with a flashlight in its face, shaken but not gone. The landmine display had done its job, and I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, I'd won. But if I'd learned anything about HOA people, it's that they treat losing like a delayed win. They don't quit, they regroup. And 3 weeks later, I found out just how deep their pettiness ran. It happened on a Monday. I'd gone into town to pick up feed, and some PVC elbows from the hardware store. Took me 2 hours round trip. When I came back, my truck, the old Ford F-250 I used for hauling lumber and firewood, was gone. Not moved, gone. I checked the field, the workshop, the side trail. Nothing but fresh tire tracks and a red plastic tag zip tied to my gate that read Unauthorized Vehicle Abatement, Silver Creek Hollow, HOA. I stood there staring at it like it might vanish if I squinted hard enough. But nope, it stayed. Bold and dumb. I called the sheriff's office. They hadn't towed anything. Called the city impound. Nothing in my name. Finally, after some digging, I found it. A small towing company in the next county over. The kind that usually deals with repossessions and shady lot removals. When I asked who authorized it, the guy on the phone said, some lady named Karen from the community board said the truck was abandoned and part of a blight case. Blight. They were calling my working farm truck a truck with tags, insurance, and a toolbox full of socket wrenches. Blight. I drove out there and got it back $487 lighter. When I returned home, there was an envelope taped to my door, official looking from a law firm I'd never heard of. Inside was an injunction. The HOA was suing me for prolonged visual contamination, vehicular disrepair, and hostile landscaping practices. Hostile landscaping practices. I sat down on the porch with the letter in one hand and a beer in the other, and I laughed so hard Buck ran inside. They'd gone full lunatic, but now it was legal. They wanted to fight in court. Fine, but I wasn't going in unarmed. I called up a buddy of mine from my Army days, Tyson Reeves. Used to run point on engineering patrols in Afghanistan. Now he worked in private security, the kind that contracts with people who say things like, no comment, and you didn't get this from me. I told him what was going on. He laughed for 5 straight minutes, then asked what kind of toys I wanted. Nothing that'll get me on a list, I said. Just enough to make him rethink pulling into my field. 3 days later, Tyson rolled up in a black van with Tennessee plates and a grin wide enough to scare a deer. Inside the van were motion sensors, heat signature lures, old surplus tripwire canisters, and one item wrapped in a crate labeled property training device, inert explosive. It was essentially a hollow landmine casing retrofitted to make a boom without the bang. But there was also something else. A real pressure-triggered concussive mine. Small yield, low radius, loud as hell. You didn't get this from me, Tyson said. But if anyone asks, it's a bird deterrent. We spent the next 2 nights installing a perimeter system just inside the tree-in. Pressure plates rigged to flare launchers and smoke canisters. Heat lures buried in a grid pattern that mimicked movement across infrared scopes. It was harmless mostly unless someone decided to get cute and dig. But the jewel of it all, the piece the resistance, was the real mine. We buried it just off the eastern edge of the property 10 feet in from the gravel loop, where Karen had for months parked her Lexus like she owned the mineral rights. We marked it clearly with fake warning signs, distress tape, and a bent metal plaque that read Test Range Live Training. It looked abandoned, governmental, perfectly illegal, and completely plausible. Then we waited. A week passed, then 2, nothing. But the HOA was up to something. I could feel it in the air. Yard sign started popping up at the subdivision entrance. Silver Creek Hollow, annual block, wide garage sale, visitors welcome, overflow parking, and designated areas. There were maps posted, arrows drawn. I knew where this was going. One red arrow pointed straight into my pasture labeled open field parking extra room. I nearly choked on my coffee. They didn't just ignore the mine warnings. They made it official. I waited until the night before the sale to make one final adjustment. Just enough to make sure the pressure sensor on the real mine would trip if someone parked a little too close. Not enough to hurt, just enough to launch the lid and flip anything lighter than a Buick. The next morning, the sun rose over a battlefield that didn't know it yet. I sat on the porch with Buck and Lucy, watching as car after car poured into the subdivision. Minivans, golf carts, pickup trucks filled with folding tables, and old lamps. The HOA board skewered around in matching polos like ants before a flood. Karen stood at the main corner directing cars. Her voice carried across the field. Overflow in the open lot. Follow the markers. I waited, and then it happened. A golf cart decorated with balloons and loaded with some kids' lemonade stand peeled off the road and rolled toward my pasture. When you live far from the city, where the wind carries the scent of soil and time seems to pause among quiet fields, you might think you've found peace in a chaotic world. But sometimes, trouble doesn't come with noise. It comes with an HOA badge, a misplaced Lexus, and someone named Karen holding a clipboard. This story, though humorous and almost absurd, carries a clear message. Never underestimate someone whose first response was silence. The people who defend their land don't do it for money or fame. They do it for honor, for memory, and for the deep-rooted dignity that land represents. They don't need an HOA, zoning laws, or shiny signs to know where the lines are, because they feel them in their blood, in their heritage, and in the bark of a dog named Buck. So, if you're the new neighbor, remember, respect boundaries, both physical and personal. A simple "may I" is worth more than any letter from a lawyer. And if you see a sign that says "Caution, Live Ordnance" on an unmarked road, maybe, just maybe, you took a wrong turn, literally and morally. And finally, never forget this. No one starts a war on ancestral land unless they're given no choice.